So my name is Melissa. Thank you very much for the invitation. I am a housing researcher. I'm a sociologist, but I do mainly housing research. And over the past 4 years, which is crazy when I think about it now, I've been studying the development of this particular senior co-housing group that has already been mentioned. It's called Featherstone. And I think I'm going to repeat a lot of what was already said in the previous talk, but I'm going to be repeating it, I think, in a way that kind of hones in into the details of the actual process of group formation, some of the issues, some of the conflicts that have come out through the co-design process in particular. So I haven't been doing this alone. I've been doing this with my colleague who couldn't be here today, Kath Scanlon, so I thought I would mention that. And this is what I'll try to do. I hope I have time to go through all of it. I'll tell you a little bit about what Featherstone is, where it is. I'll kind of situate it. I'll give you some images about the house and the site. And then I'll tell you a little bit about how the group developed, who this group actually is, who are these people. So we're talking about diversity and community. So we can kind of question that through these individuals that have come together. And then I'll go into the co-design process per se, which is really the moment where this group came to know each other as a group. So it wasn't just a moment to come together and be together, but it was the moment where they managed to kind of think about their differences and perhaps work through some of those differences, but through design. And then some of the broader issues and the lessons, I'll try and bring some of those out, which I think we've already discussed, but we can go into a bit further. I don't think I'll have time to do this last thing that I wanted to do, but if anybody's interested, we can talk about it after. I've also been working on a project on the housing supply crisis in London. London's a very particular context, as you all know, for housing. So, even for co-housing, it's kind of a different world. And one of the streams that we've been looking at in terms of supply crisis, we have 4 themes. One of them is alternative housing, which includes co-housing, but not solely co-housing. So things like self-build, live workspaces, alternative technologies, etc. And we've gotten into some really interesting conversations with local authority people. It's a knowledge exchange project, so we've had people that don't normally talk to each other about what are the challenges to developing alternative housing and what is alternative housing. And I think, Lucy, you said alternative, that concept kind of is seen as something negative, but also people don't even understand what we mean when we say alternative to begin with. So not to kind of hone in on this too much because we've already said what the UK Co-housing Network means by co-housing, but mainly it's intentional communities created and run by their residents where each household has a private home, but residents come together to manage their community, share activities, eat together, etc. There is a historical association to utopic communities, to things like self-build, to sharing, and to communes. But people today really in the world of co-housing are kind of motivated by actively participating in the creation of their own homes, whether that's in the design process or the design and the development, or if they didn't come in at the design process, then being kind of actively engaged with the maintenance of that structure once it's formed. Like Maria said, it can be intergenerational, it can be senior. The one that we've been looking at is a senior co-housing group. It can be all owner occupation, it can be mixed tenure, it can be all rental, it can be in mutual ownership. And traditionally, what happens is that co-housing groups come together in a kind of bottom-up fashion, right? So it's people that know each other, friends, people with similar views or visions or ideals, and they decide to do this thing, and they go out and they do it. What's happening more and more, we know, is that there's a kind of top-down process whereby you have, like Maria explained, a developer, a straightforward individual for-profit developer, or you can have something like a housing association that works in theory with the community cooperatively so that you can kind of develop co-housing together. So there's a variety of arrangements, and co-housing, Featherstone co-housing falls within the top-down, if you will, model. And just to give you a picture of what it is and where it is, this is the house. This is the main house that was bought to develop Featherstone co-housing. It's a very old Victorian house from 1858, has 18 bedrooms. It was originally a kind of retreat for wealthy families. This is the view from the backside of that house, which they hope to refurbish. Very, very large. And in the 1960s, it was turned into an experimental drug rehabilitation center, actually the first experimental drug rehabilitation center in the UK, later called Phoenix House, that you might all be familiar with. But it was the first Phoenix House model, if you will. And this is a picture from the archives of Phoenix House back in the 70s, and the group doing, having a party in the backyard. It's located in Lewisham in South London, which is, for those of you that don't know, it's a suburban neighborhood called Forest Hill in South London, which is indeed very hilly. And in fact, this house is located on the top of a very, very steep hill, which comes with all kinds of complications in terms of thinking about senior co-housing. But it's also very green, it's very leafy, it's very attractive because it's rather remote, so it's very quiet. And one of the very remarkable things about this site is that it does retain this huge 0.64 hectare garden. In the area, you still have large Victorian mansions like this, but most of them have been turned into institutional use, like Phoenix House, or they're still institutional use, but their gardens would have been sold off. All of these large gardens were sold off for housing development in the 50s and the 60s. This is the only site in the area that has retained the garden. So, this is, and I'll talk about this a little bit, this is one of the issues that the group really coalesced around, that they wanted to keep this garden as a central focus, and they didn't want to really kind of, the new build to go into it too much. This is a view from the top. You get these spectacular views of London as well. Lots of trees. So just to give you then a sense of the trajectory of the group, how it started, how it came together. Started in 2011 when a local couple from Forest Hill, actually, who knew this house and knew its history, saw that it was up for sale. This was in the middle of the financial crisis, really. They had been interested in co-housing, so they approached Hanover Housing Association, the same that's working with Maria in both of the groups that she spoke about. And they told Hanover, look, there's this site. It's actually extremely cheap for the kind of land it is because it was the moment that it was. Do you want to buy it, and do you want to let us kind of form a co-housing group? They said, yes, perfect. We're happy to do that. At that moment, they had a director that was a bit more positive about the notion of co-housing and senior co-housing. And they were keen on becoming the kind of pioneers of co-housing at that point in time in London. So they bought the site for very cheap, for £1.4 million for this huge site. And so the arrangement that they came, which is the usual arrangement when housing associations pair up with these groups, is that they would pay the mortgage, they would cover the architect's fees, they would cover the construction costs, while this original couple, would recruit new members. They would create a co-housing group, if you will, and then these individuals would buy units, but at the same time there would be shared ownership, and there would be some social rented as well, because the local authority requires that from housing associations. And that once everything was developed, they would get their units sold at 10% of 10% less than the market cost. That was the kind of implicit assumption. And because it's South London, it was kind of understood that it was going to be cheaper than a regular kind of London or North London co-house. That hasn't happened, and I'll come back to that. And just to say that originally what they thought is that the maximum price would be £250,000. That would be the largest unit would go for £250,000, okay? So who joined? Okay, they did this open house. They had about 50 people that were interested. There was a lot of buzz around it. And since the beginning, there's been a kind of range between a core 7 to 15 people. I think at the moment, you could say there's about 12 core members still. And they're mostly women. There's always been 75% at least of women that form the group. Mostly single, although there are some couples. And there are a lot of alternative housing insiders, what we would call them. We found this out as we were doing the research, actually, that maybe 90% of the people there either work in the housing world themselves with local authorities, or they had been, in squats or other kinds of alternative housing in the past, or they were already interested in co-housing and they were kind of shopping around in different kind of co-housing groups. And there's a few architects that were also part of the group. So people that knew about housing. We were talking about diversity, mainly white. We had 2 non-white participants that have since left, and that's, I think, very much tied to the class discussion that we were having, and I think it's an important discussion to have in terms of multiculturalism and multi-ethnicity, mostly middle income as well. And it's interesting because they fashioned themselves when we began as, they said they were the working class co-housing group of London because they weren't in North London, you know, they were the working class South Londoners. Again, that's been very much put into question with the new prices. And they're mainly from South London, so not from the immediate neighborhood, but from the larger kind of South London environment. Right, so just to say that since 2011, they've continued to meet once a month. So this is the one thing that has remained true, you know, with people coming and going. They meet once a month over lunch in the building, and they discuss whatever is happening at that particular moment in time. So the way that the process developed was that 2 months after coming together, they created a brief for architects. They were led to believe by the Housing Association that they were going to be able to choose their own architects. What actually happened is that the architects were kind of imposed upon them after they'd already had internal discussions about what kind of architects they wanted to have. Ultimately, they've been very happy with the architects. It's the same architects that Hanover uses for the other groups in London. They're, you know, one of the only specialists working on co-housing as architects, so they're fantastic, they're very good, the group's very happy with them, and yet there's a kind of internal sense of resentment that this is one of the many issues with the Housing Association, and one of the first ones where there was a very clear imposition put upon them about who they had to work with and how they had to work with these architects. And like Maria said, the group also feels that actually, even though there was this whole participatory process, in fact, the scheme, the architects knew what scheme they wanted to come up with in the end, and they kind of just maneuvered their way to getting to that scheme anyway, but that the process was engaging and fruitful in any case. They expected to do it all over 4 meetings. Yeah, exactly. Like so many other things that were expected and took so much longer. And it wasn't just that, of course, it almost sounds ridiculous that that would happen in 4 meetings, but this is also an extremely complex site. Like I said, it's on top of a hill. They had all sorts of issues about the trees that had to be conserved, about the neighbors that were both individual and institutional, about the kind of nature of the streets, both in front and on the side. So there were all kinds of discussions about the relationship to the public realm, about accessibility, about the orientation of the homes in relation to the neighbors and the relationship to the neighbors. And that took a lot longer than was expected. And so the way that it evolved, really, and I think that's the way it evolves with all co-housing groups, and it's a kind of model of co-design, is that you move from the general to the specific, and the architects ask the group members to come with their very broad aspirations, goals, and ideals around what it is that they think they want to live like as a group, but also in terms of their individual homes, so that they can get to some kind of design. And I think what I wanted to emphasize really is that I think, like I mentioned in the beginning, that designing and kind of engaging with the material really, with co-housing in particular, it's a unique process that allows us to see all kinds of social interactions and all kinds of social issues that perhaps wouldn't come out if you don't have a design element as part of it. And that's unique and that it's worth kind of thinking about more carefully, particularly with a group of people that didn't know each other beforehand. And so, in that design process, you had all kinds of disagreements and all kinds of agreements that teach us things about who these people were and how they interacted. So, for instance, they very much coalesced around this issue that the garden was important, retaining that tree was important, and they would do anything to retain that tree. And if that tree was going to get cut, you know, people would leave. So that was a basic element there that everybody agreed in. And you would think that maybe if they had this kind of attention to the green space, and they talked about green space, that they also had a kind of ecological view or vision of the world, or something that they shared in that respect. But in fact, once they started talking about things like sharing washing machines or sharing other kinds of activities that would make their lifestyle more ecological, there were all sorts of contention. And so some things that you might read and say, oh, look how green-oriented this group is. Actually, when you start looking at other issues, you see that, this isn't so clear-cut, actually. There was a lot of skepticism about using things like solar power, reusing water. So they had all kinds of discussions, and what they've come up with in the end is a very traditional, actually slightly ecological, but not very ecological project. It's also a lot about costs and cost considerations, of course. They were also in agreement, of course, about the concept of senior co-housing. They're all there in a senior co-housing project, so they agree with that. However, because they hadn't discussed what they meant individually by senior co-housing, there was an assumption that they all agreed about what that was. And in fact, when you start talking about the design aspects of senior co-housing, suddenly the disagreements about what they mean by being old or aging start to come out. So issues around how wide a door would be, or what kind of elements of the lifetime homes requirements you put into the house and how people felt around those were vastly different, actually. And a lot of people are there because they don't have another choice. They would have rather gone to an intergenerational co-housing project, but they only had this senior co-housing project to choose from in South London, so that's where they went. But they would actually like the noise and they would like the children. And so there's conflicts there around aspirations about what it means to live old well. There's other issues that dominated certain discussions, and I think are important to point out, which is that there was a kind of marginalization of minority voices because there wasn't a process in place of decision making, et cetera, and all of this was happening through design. For instance, everybody accepted the notion of sustainability, very much like senior co-housing or aging. It's a broad term. People were fairly, in agreement about that. But when it came down to talking about things like self-build, which one of the residents wanted to do, it became an issue. So everybody was, in principle, in favor of self-build, but once they had to think about the cost implications of that, about the design implications of that, nobody really wanted to go into it, and they didn't really want to talk about it. And so they just kind of quiet her down every time she started to talk about that. This happened over a long period of time in different conversations and ways, but ultimately she left the group, and it was a really kind of, discouraging kind of process for some of the people there that were in favor of self-build and would have liked to go for it. And then finally, there was the issue of the use of the co-house, and that's one of the most important design aspects of getting to know each other as a group, what you want to do collectively, how you want to use that space, whether you want to use it for a sauna or for movies or for yoga or for dining. And so those discussions allow you as a group to kind of think about what you have in common or what you don't have in common. And of course it did for them. How am I doing for time? 5 minutes? Okay. So this is kind of what they came out with in the end, the final design. They have 33 units that are going to be built. So they're going to refurbish that main house that I showed you, and there's going to be some apartments there. There's going to be new build on the back side of the project, but on the sides of that garden. So there's going to be new build on the right and on the left, and at the bottom of the garden as well on the left. And they discussed parking a lot. That was another hugely contentious issue around what they meant by being senior and what they meant in terms of their ecological beliefs, if they were going to be using a car or not using a car. And we could have a whole lecture just on that. But they did end up, because the local authority required it, with parking both in the front and in the back side. They only wanted it up in the front, but they forced them to have some in the back. And the co-house was designed to have all of these activities that I won't read out, but are here. And the co-house is going to be concentrated in the main house. So they talked about creating a new structure in the back, but actually it was very costly, and also it would have kind of gone into the garden, so they decided to just have it in the main lodge. So briefly, just to say what's been happening since the design finished, very little. There's been a kind of long waiting process. Firstly, in terms of planning and all the uncertainties and the anxieties that are generated about whether you are going to get planning or not. A lot of people left in that process, just waiting around. They had to go to 2 different planning meetings before they had approval. There was hugely kind of contentious relationship with the neighbors and with the immediate neighbors who came and complained a lot about this development, and very little effort, speaking frankly here, from the group's part to kind of do any kind of outreach effort with the neighbors. And that's, I think, one of the huge lessons for any co-housing group is to, if you are in this kind of process where you do have to get planning application, to involve your neighbors, to involve your community to the extent possible and explain to them what you're about. Because a lot of the neighbors felt that they didn't understand what co-housing was, and what they were saying was, this is just an excuse for developers, and they're going to build, and because the housing topic is so hot in London, they're just going to build a huge tower. And of course they can't do that, but this is the notion that they had. This group is just going to take over, and then they're going to build a huge tower, and they're going to ruin the community. And so, just explaining to them who you are in a friendly environment goes a long way. They got their planning application, then they had to go out to builders to get different costs for what it would actually cost to build, and what it would cost them as residents. And this is where I come back to the pricing issue. So what's happened is that it is now about 75% over what they thought that they would be paying. So you have these people that have been involved for almost 4 years in a very tiring, very long process, and are many of them seeing themselves that they can't afford that, still waiting it out because they've come back to the housing association and asked them to get new building costs if they can. So they're in that waiting process at the moment, but the momentum has gone down for sure, and people are leaving, and the others are waiting, just hoping that the best will happen because they've already invested so much time. This is us as researchers, and just very briefly then, some of the kind of wider or broader lessons that I think have been learned so far. Yeah, so I think that the co-design, like I said, hugely important in terms of them coalescing as a group. And I think we shouldn't downplay design or that co-design process as a moment where community can happen. It happens in its own way. However, it also, like Maria was mentioning, when you have to focus on the design because you have to get a scheme in place very quickly, you don't have the time to concentrate on your group formation process. And I think one of the huge lessons, again, from Featherstone is that they haven't really had the time to develop as a group, to know each other, to know what their strengths and weaknesses are, to even know what they mean collectively by co-housing. So they keep kind of going around generalities, but they haven't had the time to really think about that more carefully. And therefore, I think formal mechanisms are very key at the beginning in terms of establishing working modes so that you can think about those broader questions. Like I said, you need to find a way to keep the momentum going, because there will come a point where things will be frustrating, where you might have a 6-month lull. And so how do you keep that momentum going? How do you keep people interested despite the fatigue, especially the co-design fatigue, because those meetings are very strenuous and they're very tiring. You need a collective approach to leadership. I didn't really talk about that too much, but in this group in particular, there was a dynamic whereby that original couple have become the kind of leaders of the group, and that happened almost organically. And they, again, didn't have the mechanisms to kind of question that democratically. And it's now been so long, it's almost impossible for people to fathom how to do that without doing an outright coup. And and it's been discussed, and it's an issue, and it's hard to know how they're going to overcome that 4 years in, because they didn't deal with it early on. And so knowledge sharing, kind of sharing management, not putting too much weight on some people and too much responsibility. And then finally, that given the price uncertainties, and this is, I think, we think as researchers, we're not sure about this, but we think this might be a very British thing as well. There was huge reluctance to reveal how much money people had at the beginning, right? People did not want to talk about money. And so it wasn't an issue. But of course it was. Until it becomes an issue. And then it became an issue. And therefore, this has to be out there. You have to create scenarios. What's your best chance? Scenario A, B, C, D. All these things could happen. And how much money do we have? And what are the different possibilities that, options that we would have if this doesn't work and if this doesn't work? And those things also weren't done here. So I'll leave it there because I don't have more time. I wanted to say some lessons about working with housing associations, but maybe you have questions, and I'll leave it there. Okay.
Thank you, Melissa.
Yeah.